There is a sediment core in the laboratories of James Cook University that most climate researchers never think to connect to a bushfire. It is roughly 1.5 meters of compacted earth, extracted from the savannas of northern Australia, and it contains 150,000 years of fire history locked in microcharcoal and ancient pollen. When Professor Michael Bird's team analysed it in 2024, they found something the geological record made unmistakable. A point, at least 11,000 years ago and likely far earlier, where the fire regime across this landscape shifted. Lightning fires did not stop. But something else began. Fires that were smaller, cooler, more frequent, and arranged in patterns that lightning does not produce. Someone was burning this country on purpose. And they did not stop for thousands upon thousands of years. Not until they were told to. I found Bird's research because I was looking for something else entirely. I had been reading about the 2019 bushfire season and trying to understand why the language around it kept defaulting to natural disaster, as though the fires were an act of fate rather than the consequence of a decision made over the course of 2 centuries. The sediment core forced me backward through the literature, and the further back I went, the more precise and more uncomfortable the picture became. Start with the occupation itself. In 2017, a team led by Chris Clarkson published in Nature the results of excavations at Madjedbebe rock shelter in the Northern Territory. The date they established was 65,000 years. Not an estimate, not a range. A date supported by multiple independent methods and peer-reviewed in one of the most demanding journals in the world. 65,000 years of continuous human occupation on a single continent. No civilization that has ever built a city, written a law, or minted a coin comes close to that timescale. And for the vast majority of that time, those people were burning. Rhys Jones coined the term firestick farming in 1969, and the phrase has shaped the research ever since. What it describes is a system of controlled, low-intensity mosaic burning in which small sections of country are fired in rotation. The burns are cool enough to leave large trees standing. They consume the understory, the dry grass, the accumulated leaf litter. And because they are set in sequence across the landscape, each new burn self-extinguishes at the edge of the previous one. The result is a patchwork of vegetation at different stages of regrowth, a landscape that cannot carry a large hot fire because the fuel is never continuous. The detail is extraordinary. Noongar people in the southwest of Western Australia burned on 3 to 4 year cycles calibrated to the local ecology. Martu women in the Western Desert used fire as a hunting tool, burning spinifex to flush monitor lizards and simultaneously regenerating the country for the next season. In Tasmania, cool fires maintained open grasslands that supported browsing animals and prevented the eucalyptus forest from closing over. Each practice was local. The principle was continental. Bill Gamage documented this in The Biggest Estate on Earth, published in 2011, drawing on more than a century of colonial accounts. What he found was consistent and damning. First Fleet officers landing in 1788 described park-like country, open grasslands with widely spaced trees, landscapes that looked, to English eyes, like a gentleman's estate. John Hunter wrote in that same year that Aboriginal people set the country on fire for several miles extent. They saw the fire. They described the result. They never once recognised it as management. Every colonist who compared the Australian landscape to an English park was describing, without knowing it, the product of 65,000 years of deliberate care. I kept reading. And here is where the history becomes something other than remarkable. Here is where it becomes a record of deliberate undoing. British colonisation did not merely displace Aboriginal people from their country, it dismantled the fire management system that had shaped that country for longer than agriculture has existed anywhere else on Earth, and it replaced it with nothing. This was not an accident, it was a structural requirement of the legal and philosophical framework that made the dispossession possible. Terra nullius is usually discussed as a legal fiction about land ownership. It was also an epistemic fiction, a way of not knowing. If the land was unoccupied, there could be no management system to recognize. If there was no management system, nothing was destroyed when the burning stopped. The erasure of knowledge was not a side effect of colonization. It was a condition of it. How do you criminalize a practice that you refuse to acknowledge ever existed? The record does not support the story of passive neglect. It supports something more precise. I checked the legislative record. The Bushfires Act of 1854 in Western Australia is among the earliest. It established penalties for unauthorised burning, which in practice meant Aboriginal burning, because the only people who had been burning that country for millennia were now required to seek permission from the government that had taken it from them. The pattern holds across every state. New South Wales passed its own Bushfires Act in 1949. Victoria's Forests Act of 1958 consolidated state control over fire management. The Land Conservation Act of 1970 further restricted burning on public land in Victoria. South Australia's Native Vegetation Acts went further still, classifying burning as land clearance, which made it an offence under environmental law to do what Aboriginal people had done sustainably for tens of thousands of years. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming here. I am not claiming that any single piece of legislation was written with the explicit intent of destroying Aboriginal fire knowledge. What I am saying is that the cumulative effect of 170 years of fire regulation was the criminalisation of a practice older than any legal system on Earth, and the replacement of that practice with a centralised European model of fire suppression that the landscape had never experienced. The evidence for what happened next is not ambiguous. A 25-year comparative study in Western Arnhem Land examined cypress pine populations across two adjacent areas. One was managed by Cooney people using traditional mosaic burning. The other was managed by Kakadu National Park authorities using government protocols. In the Cooney-managed country, the cypress pine thrived. In the adjacent Kakadu land, it collapsed. The same species, the same climate, the same soil. The only variable was who was doing the burning and how. I found a parallel study closer to the southeast. In 2022, researchers at the University of Melbourne published a paper in the journal Fire examining 120 years of vegetation and fire regime change in Gunaikurnai country in the Buchan region of Gippsland, Victoria. What they documented was a transformation. For the first decades after colonisation, some settler farmers in the Buchan district continued to burn their back paddocks in autumn. They had learned the practice, or inherited it, from watching Gunaikurnai people manage the country before them. I am paraphrasing the study's language here, but the finding is clear: mimicry of Aboriginal burning persisted among settlers in some areas for nearly a century. Then it stopped. The legislative tightening of the mid-20th century, the Forests Act, the Land Conservation Act, the increasing regulation of private burning, ended the practice. And the country responded. The Melbourne study documents the change in terms that are as close to a controlled experiment as landscape history allows. Open grassland gave way to dense scrub. Sightlines that had been clear for generations closed within a decade. The eucalyptus understory thickened with dry bark and accumulated leaf litter, exactly the fuel load that Aboriginal burning had prevented from building for thousands of years. I keep trying to find a way to describe what that landscape change would have felt like to someone who knew the country before. The grass is gone. The smell is wrong. Where there had been open woodland, there is now a wall of vegetation so dense that the wind sounds different moving through it. The country is not empty, it is overfull, choked with the fuel that 65,000 years of careful burning had kept in check. What do you call a system that destroys 65,000 years of knowledge and then prosecutes anyone who tries to restore it? Go back to Gippsland. Go back to the Buchan country in 1976. There is a Gunakurnai elder standing at the edge of country their grandparents kept open with fire. The burning has stopped. Not because the knowledge was lost. The knowledge is right there, held in the body of a person standing on their own land. It stopped because the law said it had to stop. The Land Conservation Council restricted burning. The scrub is returning. It is visible in a single generation, the closing of a sightline that had been clear for longer than Rome existed. The elder knows what this country looks like when it is cared for. They know what it sounds like, what it smells like, how the grass grows back green after a cool burn, and how the kangaroos return to the new growth within days, and they know what the dense, dry understory building around them will do when it finally catches. Not if. When, 43 years later, it caught, the Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020 burned 24 million hectares. 3 billion animals were killed or displaced. 33 people died directly. 4,000 residents and tourists were evacuated from the beach at Malakuta, on the coast of Gippsland, under a sky that turned red and then black. The fire that reached Malakuta ran through country that had not been properly burned in decades, through exactly the kind of accumulated fuel load that mosaic burning had prevented for millennia. The question I keep returning to is not why the fires came. The question is why we still speak of them as if they were natural. The pattern is not unique to Australia. Wherever imperial expansion encountered indigenous land management, it followed the same sequence. Managed landscapes were reclassified as wilderness. Local knowledge was reclassified as ignorance, and the catastrophes that followed the removal of that knowledge were reclassified as natural disasters, as though the land had always burned this way, as though no one had ever known how to prevent it. The West Arnhem Land Fire Abatement Project exists. It uses Aboriginal burning methods. It generates carbon credits under the Australian government's own climate policy. The knowledge works. It has always worked. But the regulatory frameworks that criminalise burning without permits remain in force across most of Australia. The permits are granted by the same institutional structures that spent 2 centuries dismantling the system that made permits unnecessary. 65,000 years of continuous land management. The longest sustained human modification of any environment on Earth. It was not 528 lost to time or to forgetting. It was made illegal. And the continent is still burning because of it.